Welcome to Immigration Briefing. The content of the briefing includes: Britain can boom again, but only if we smash the can't do consensus. Far-right parties eye gains in next year's EU Parliament elections. America's best strategy for Cold War II is 200 years old. Canada desperately needs a new generation of entrepreneurs, and we can achieve through immigration and inclusion. Why more Chinese are risking danger in southern border crossings to US. Britain can boom again, but only if we smash the can't do consensus. Telegraph. There are commentators, politicians and officials in the UK who refuse to accept the need for change and instead argue that the status quo is inevitable and cannot be altered, according to Conservative MP, George Freeman. He criticizes those who argue that economic growth is not possible or that immigration levels cannot be controlled, and insists that alternative models should be considered. For example, he suggests that rather than relying on mass immigration, higher wages and better training should be encouraged. Freeman also argues that human rights laws are preventing the government from effectively dealing with illegal migration. He calls for a change of mindset, arguing that the current complacency is preventing progress. Freeman concludes that the worldview of liberals and centrists is falling apart and that they refuse to accept this because it would mean admitting the failure of their policies and their entire philosophy. He concludes that a different future is possible if the UK is willing to embrace it. Far-right parties eye gains in next year's EU Parliament elections. Reuters. Far-right parties from around a dozen European countries have met in Italy to discuss reshaping the European Union after next year's European Parliament elections. The parties aim to toughen the EU's position on immigration and soften its climate policies. Italian Deputy Prime Minister Matteo Salvini, who hosted the meeting, expressed his objective of becoming at least the third largest group in the EU Parliament. The far-right Identity and Democracy Group is currently the sixth largest, but current polling data place it in fourth position. The meeting was inspired by the recent success of Geert Wilders' anti-immigration Freedom Party in the Netherlands. America's best strategy for Cold War II is 200 years old. Bloomberg. The Monroe Doctrine, a U.S. foreign policy that declared the American continents off-limits to European colonization, remains relevant today in the face of growing Russian and Chinese influence in Latin America. It is important for the U.S. to maintain its regional supremacy in order to protect its global power and interests. The U.S. should pursue a policy of regional cooperation and deepen trade, manufacturing, and financial relationships in the Western Hemisphere in order to counter Chinese economic influence. It should also invest in democratic institutions and civil society, as well as rebuild relationships with the region's militaries. The Monroe Doctrine remains an important tool for the U.S. to protect its strategic interests and maintain its influence in Latin America. Canada desperately needs a new generation of entrepreneurs, and we can achieve through immigration and inclusion. The Toronto Star. Canada needs to build a more inclusive entrepreneurial community in order to secure the future of its small business sector and international competitiveness, according to Karen Grieve-Young, CEO of nonprofit Futurepreneur. Speaking to the Toronto Star, she said racialized entrepreneurs, particularly Indigenous and Black entrepreneurs, have historically had unequal access to business financing compared to white entrepreneurs. Futurepreneur aims to address this imbalance by offering loan financing and mentorship programs for young entrepreneurs, with a diverse leadership team. Young said this has resulted in Indigenous-led businesses being represented at a rate 3 times that of Canada's average and Black-led businesses at a rate 10 times the average. Why more Chinese are risking danger in southern border crossings to U.S. New York Times. A growing number of Chinese migrants are entering the U.S. via the dangerous Darien Gap in Panama, fleeing from economic prospects and political oppression in China. Educated and affluent Chinese are migrating legally through education and work visas, while others are following a playbook on social media, cross the Darien Gap, surrender to U.S. border control officers, get detained in immigration jails, and apply for asylum. Many will be released within days and can work and start a new life in the U.S. when their asylum applications are accepted. The Chinese migrants' flight signifies a lack of faith in Xi Jinping's governance model and a fear of falling into poverty should the Chinese economy worsen. The Darien Gap route is a dangerous one, previously used mostly by Cubans and Haitians. However, this year, a growing number of Chinese migrants have been entering the U.S. through this route. According to U.S. Customs and Border Protection, more than 24,000 Chinese migrants were temporarily detained on the southern border of the U.S. in the 2023 fiscal year, compared to fewer than 15,000 over the previous decade. Migrants crossing the Darien Gap come from lower middle-class backgrounds and fear falling into poverty should the Chinese economy worsen. They also fear oppression in China, where anyone can become a target of the state for their religious beliefs or for petitioning for their rights. However, starting a new life in the US is difficult, with expensive and shabby housing in immigrant neighborhoods. Many Chinese migrants find work in Chinese restaurants in the US, where the pay is better than in China, and they can send more money home. 3 asylum seekers struggling to find a foothold in Toronto tell their stories. It's not an easy thing, leaving your people behind. The Toronto Star. Refugees and asylum seekers in Toronto are being turned away from the overcrowded shelter system, with over 40% of the city's 9,122 shelter spaces occupied by refugee claimants, according to Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada. The city is unable to cope with the 50% increase in asylum claims so far this year, leaving many on the streets or in makeshift shelters. The lack of resources is causing refugees to feel isolated, re-traumatized and unsheltered. One asylum claimant unable to access shelter has already died. The city and Ottawa are locked in a dispute over funding and nobody is taking full responsibility for the crisis. Serious violent and sexual offenders could be locked up again under new preventative detention regime. ABC. The Australian government is proposing new laws to expand the country's preventative detention regime in order to redetain serious violent and sexual offenders who were released following a high court ruling on indefinite detention. The legislation, named the Community Safety Scheme, is modeled on anti-terror laws and would allow the immigration minister to raise concerns about individuals who pose an unacceptable risk to the community. A court would then decide whether to redetain the individuals for a maximum of 3 years. The government has urged the opposition to support the legislation and pass it before Parliament finishes for the year on Thursday. Democrats need to stand firm on foreign aid and immigration, Representative Jayapal says. Politico. Democratic Representative Pramila Jayapal has urged her party to stand firm against Republican attempts to condition foreign aid on changes to immigration policy. Jayapal accused Republicans of holding aid to Ukraine and Israel hostage in order to destroy the asylum system. She called on Democrats to vote on the aid package without the proposed border policy changes, arguing that the Biden administration's policies were proving effective. Republicans have argued that changes are needed to address the number of immigrants arriving at the southern border, particularly with regards to the parole system and asylum applications. Jayapal accused Republicans of seeking to destroy the immigration system through these proposals. Ukrainians in Germany weigh wrenching choice, stay or go home. New York Times. As the war in Ukraine approaches its 3rd year, increasing numbers of Ukrainian refugees are facing a difficult choice. Should they go back to Ukraine, where the fighting is far from over, or establish a new life in countries such as Germany? Although Ukraine has been promised extensive financial and political support, the death and destruction are likely to continue, and it is unclear how long the support will last. Germany has been largely welcoming to the 1.2 million Ukrainian refugees living in the country, with the German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, calling on firms to increase hiring of Ukrainians. However, despite the opportunities, only around 20% of working-age Ukrainians are currently employed. The situation in Germany is mirrored across Europe, with many Ukrainians facing a similar dilemma. For many of the refugees, the initial journey to Germany led them to major cities such as Berlin, but a lack of affordable housing has meant that many have been forced to live in refugee centers for up to a year. A few have been able to find work, but others have not been able to enroll their children in schools without a private address. My elderly father bought £90,000 of gold bars and handed them to fraudsters. Telegraph. A couple in their late 70s have been tricked by fraudsters into buying £90,815 of gold bars from a West Midlands jeweler, having been told their bank accounts were at risk of fraud. The fraudsters claimed to be from the police. Action Fraud dropped the case, while Barclays declined to refund the money. The bank has admitted that its systems failed to identify the rogue payments. Barclays has now reimbursed the couple in full. Judges to have power to jail detainees under new federal laws. The Sydney Morning Herald. The Australian government is introducing new laws that would allow judges to order the redetention of individuals who have been released from immigration detention. The laws are being proposed in response to a High Court ruling that found indefinite detention to be unlawful. The proposed legislation would create both a community safety detention order and a community safety supervision order, which judges would rule on. If a court finds that an individual poses an unacceptable risk of committing a serious violent or sexual offense, they could be redetained. The laws are likely to be debated this week. Dozens of Iranian regime officials denied entry to Canada, says border agency. CBC. The Canada Border Services Agency has denied entry to dozens of senior Iranian regime officials and is investigating about 100 people with status in Canada for potential ties to Tehran. The agency has also referred the cases of 9 individuals with status in Canada to the Immigration and Refugee Board to determine their admissibility to Canada. The denials and investigations are a result of a measure adopted by the Liberal government last year after protests in Iran over the death of a Kurdish Iranian woman. The government designated the Islamic Republic of Iran as a regime that has engaged in terrorism and systematic and gross human rights violations under immigration laws. Montreal refugee struggles every day apart from family, with no reunion in sight. CBC. Refugees in Canada face long delays before being reunited with their families, with the estimated processing time for dependent family members being 48 months, according to Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada, IRCC. This wait time is causing significant emotional distress and mental health impacts for refugees who are separated from their loved ones. The federal government is being urged to introduce a visa that would allow the family of recognized refugees to stay in Canada while their applications are being processed. Time to solve the illegal migrant crisis once and for all. Telegraph. The UK Parliament must assert its sovereignty in the Nationality and Borders Bill, according to Conservative MP Sir Bill Cash. Cash argues that the legislation should include a notwithstanding clause to override international obligations, such as the Human Rights Act and the Refugee Convention. He cites previous court judgments that support the principle of parliamentary sovereignty, and argues that the House of Lords has no basis for opposing bills that uphold this principle. Cash also highlights the new Migration and Asylum Pact proposed by the European Union, which would impose quotas on member states and penalise non-compliance. Tory civil war over migration risks fueling a care home crisis. Telegraph. The UK government is considering measures to restrict immigration of care home workers in an attempt to bring down net migration figures. The care sector in the UK has been heavily reliant on overseas workers due to staffing shortages, with 154,000 overseas workers coming to the UK in the year to June 2023. However, ministers are now exploring options including preventing care home workers from bringing their families, raising salary thresholds, and removing care workers from the government's shortage occupation list. The moves have sparked panic within the care sector, with industry leaders warning that restricting overseas workers could lead to wage inflation and force some providers to close, potentially jeopardizing efforts to reduce NHS waiting lists. However, failing to tackle the issue risks inflaming tensions within the Conservative Party and alienating voters. The government placed social care workers on the shortage occupation list in February 2022 to make it easier for employers to sponsor care workers for visas, but suggestions that this may now change have worried the industry. That's all for today's news. Let's recap quickly. Conservative MP George Freeman argues that Britain can boom again if it breaks free from the can't-do consensus and embraces change. Far-right parties in Europe are looking to gain ground in next year's EU Parliament elections, focusing on immigration and climate policies. The US should invoke the Monroe Doctrine to counter Russian and Chinese influence in Latin America. Canada needs to foster an inclusive entrepreneurial community through immigration and inclusion. More Chinese migrants are risking danger to enter the US through the Darien Gap in Panama. Toronto is struggling to provide shelter for the increasing number of refugees and asylum seekers. Australia is proposing new laws to redetain serious violent and sexual offenders who were previously released. Democratic Representative Pramila Jayapal calls on Democrats to stand firm on foreign aid and immigration. Ukrainians in Germany face a difficult choice between returning home or starting a new life in a foreign country. A couple in the UK were tricked into buying gold bars by fraudsters. Australian judges may have the power to jail detainees under new laws. Canada has denied entry to Iranian regime officials and is investigating others for potential ties to Tehran. Refugees in Canada face long delays in being reunited with their families, causing emotional distress. The UK Parliament must assert its sovereignty in the Nationality and Borders Bill, according to MP Sir Bill Cash. The UK government is considering measures to restrict immigration of care home workers, potentially causing a crisis in the care sector. Now, let's dive into some analysis. It's clear that immigration is a recurring theme in today's news. From the UK to Europe, Canada, the US, and Australia, countries are grappling with the challenges and opportunities that come with immigration. The debates range from economic growth and national sovereignty to humanitarian concerns and social integration. It's a complex issue with no easy solutions, but one thing is certain: immigration will continue to shape our societies and policies in the years to come. In the UK, there's a clear divide between those who advocate for a more open approach to immigration and those who believe in stricter controls. The Conservative MP George Freeman falls into the latter category, arguing that Britain can only boom again if it breaks free from the can't-do consensus and embraces change. He challenges the prevailing narrative that economic growth is not possible and that immigration levels cannot be controlled. Instead, he suggests alternative models, such as focusing on higher wages and better training to attract workers. It's an interesting perspective that challenges the status quo and calls for a change of mindset. Meanwhile, far-right parties in Europe are looking to gain ground in next year's EU Parliament elections. Their focus is on toughening the EU's position on immigration and softening its climate policies. This is a concerning trend that could further polarize European politics and hinder efforts to address pressing global issues such as climate change. The US, on the other hand, is looking to invoke the Monroe Doctrine to counter Russian and Chinese influence in Latin America. This foreign policy, which declared the American continents off-limits to European colonization, is being revisited in the face of growing Russian and Chinese influence in the region. The US sees Latin America as a key battleground in its competition with China for global power and influence. By deepening trade and financial relationships and investing in democratic institutions, the US hopes to maintain its regional supremacy and protect its strategic interests. In Canada, the focus is on building an inclusive entrepreneurial community through immigration and inclusion. The country recognizes the need to support racialized entrepreneurs, particularly Indigenous and Black entrepreneurs, who have historically faced unequal access to business financing. By offering loan financing and mentorship programs, Canada hopes to level the playing field and secure the future of its small business sector. It's a commendable effort to address systemic inequalities and foster economic growth. Moving to the US, we see a growing number of Chinese migrants risking danger to enter the country through the Darien Gap in Panama. They are fleeing economic prospects and political oppression in China, and they see the US as a land of opportunity and freedom. This trend reflects a lack of faith in Xi Jinping's governance model and a fear of falling into poverty should the Chinese economy worsen. It's a stark reminder of the challenges faced by migrants around the world and the difficult choices they have to make. In Toronto, the city is struggling to provide shelter for the increasing number of refugees and asylum seekers. Overcrowded shelters and a lack of resources are leaving many on the streets or in makeshift shelters. This is a humanitarian crisis that demands urgent attention and action. It's a reminder that the global refugee crisis is not confined to far-flung regions, it's happening right here in our own backyard. Australia is proposing new laws to redetain serious, violent and sexual offenders who were previously released. This is a response to a High Court ruling that found indefinite detention to be unlawful. The aim is to protect the community from individuals who pose an unacceptable risk. It's a delicate balance between public safety and individual rights, and it's a reminder of the complex legal and ethical issues surrounding immigration and detention. In the US, Democratic Representative Pramila Jayapal is calling on her party to stand firm on foreign aid and immigration. She accuses Republicans of holding aid to Ukraine and Israel hostage in order to destroy the asylum system. This is a stark reminder of the partisan divisions and political gamesmanship that hinder progress on important issues. Jayapal's call for Democrats to vote on the aid package without the proposed border policy changes is a plea to prioritize humanitarian concerns over political maneuvering. In Ukraine, increasing numbers of refugees face a difficult choice between returning home or establishing a new life in countries like Germany. The war in Ukraine shows no signs of ending, and the support promised by the international community may not be enough to rebuild the country. This is a heartbreaking dilemma faced by many refugees around the world. It highlights the long-lasting impacts of conflict and the challenges faced by displaced populations. In the UK, a couple in their late 70s were tricked by fraudsters into buying gold bars. This is a reminder of the vulnerability of elderly individuals to scams and fraud. It's a cautionary tale that serves as a reminder to be vigilant and skeptical of too good to be true offers. Lastly, the UK government is considering measures to restrict immigration of care home workers. This is a response to the need to bring down net migration figures. However, it risks exacerbating the staffing shortages in the care sector and potentially jeopardizing efforts to reduce NHS waiting lists. It's a reminder that immigration policies have real-world consequences and that a balanced approach is needed to address the needs of both the economy and society. That's all for today's news analysis. As always, I encourage you to share your thoughts and join the discussion. What are your thoughts on the issues raised in today's news? Do you have any personal experiences or perspectives to share? I look forward to hearing from you. Thank you for tuning in. The content above showcases the latest briefing reports and analytical synopses, thoughtfully curated by the 6Do team. These insights stem from a wide array of reputable media outlets, think tanks, government sources, and specialized experts worldwide. We encourage you to explore these sources for a comprehensive perspective. Keep in mind that while the content may not always align with the official standpoint of 6DO Brief, it's not meant to be taken as absolute directives for decision-making. Comprising seasoned media professionals, learned scholars, and accomplished scientists, the 6DO team embodies a trailblazing, fully independent media entity. To customize 6DO Brief to meet your professional needs, you have the option to subscribe to a diverse array of briefings on our website, 6dobrief.com. Regardless of your location, you can conveniently receive 6DO Brief via email.